Welcome to this Considered Opinions podcast.
I'm Dougal.
And I'm Celia. Thank you for joining us.
If you listen to the legacy media, they would have you believe that everything is terrible, that Trump is tanking the world economy, all because of his tariffs. But is that true? Today we're going to talk about the Trump tariffs, their impact on the world economy, the pros and cons in tariffs. Are there any pros, or is it only cons? Because certainly the conventional economic theory says tariffs are bad always and everywhere.
Isn't that Milton Friedman who first espoused that idea?
Certainly Friedman was not a fan of tariffs, and his arguments were basically that it's a tax on the consumer. So if you put tariffs on other people's goods, you're really just upping costs for your own people.
Interestingly enough, that's actually the line that the legacy media and people who you might traditionally consider to be leftists are actually using that argument. But Milton Friedman...
He was not. He was very definitely, he would be what you would call a libertarian. He was very much of the other side. However...
It's a convenient argument.
It's a convenient argument at the moment, and the legacy media will use any argument that suits them at any given time. It wouldn't surprise me if they changed tack tomorrow and argued exactly the opposite if Trump dropped the tariffs.
Yeah. One of the things for me that I found interesting when the tariffs were first announced, and I wasn't following it very closely, but it was, so I didn't have a formed opinion. And there was a lot of like, oh, this is really bad, this is going to be terrible, this is going to tank the economy. And I was kind of thinking, why would you put tariffs on? It seems awfully America first, which is good for America, but in our global economy, that seems to be like there's a wider implications to that other nations, because let's face it, we live in a American empire. So
Yes.
What America does, they say when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. What America does impact us. So I
Yes.
felt like there needed to be some consideration beyond America first in the behaviour of
The policies, the American, American economic policies.
Exactly. And then I found out that actually it's not America that's invented or tariffs. It's not Trump that's invented tariffs and putting them on. That there's a lot of countries and conglomerations, if you like, so the EU as a bloc.
EU and China both have had large amounts of tariffs on America. So yes, there is an illusion that can be that maybe some people have fallen into, thinking that somehow Trump putting tariffs on
is a new thing
or is somehow an escalation. No, other people put tariffs on the US.
For me, finding out that these other countries have tariffs in place and have had tariffs in place for many years, and quite high rates, particularly from someone like the EU, that made a big difference to how I felt about the tariffs. It didn't seem like it was an out-of-the-blue, selfish decision.
Well, this is why Trump talks about reciprocity, because he's not simply starting a trade war. The tariffs or the trade war has already been started by others. Now, there is a point that you raise. The EU is not a good example of how to do tariffs, because one of the things about tariffs, if you're trying to develop your own industry, what you don't do is put tariffs on the raw materials. So, and that's what the EU does. They will block people's agricultural goods, they'll block raw materials like
So this is the imports into the EU.
Imports into the EU, because those imports into the EU of raw materials are what go into making the value-added industrial goods that they're then going to try and sell back to the rest of the world. China, on the other hand, they didn't tariff, say, Australian iron ore, because they were turning that into steel, which they were then turning into cars, phones, ships. Now, they did get into, a wee while back now, into a bit of a spat with Australia, and they did start to tariff, but that would be a mistake or a bad use of tariffs, because it in actual fact ends up hurting their own production.
So America's not the only country in the world that is using tariffs for the benefit of their home nation or home manufacturers. And I think that's the important thing to remember, is that with tariffs, sure, it might not be the ideal. And I think with the whole tariffs are only bad, which you might say is the Friedman model of
Yes.
or viewpoint on tariffs, it's a lot more nuanced than that.
It is. Here's another way that you can explain Trump's use of tariffs, that he's not using them as tariffs. He's using them as a negotiating tool.
Well, that's interesting you said that, because Trump is an expert negotiator
Yes.
and has lots of experience of it in the business world. And the thing to do in business negotiations is you come out hard with an outrageous offer,
Yes.
and then you wait for that counter offer, and there's haggling that goes on then.
Yes.
And so at the moment we're in that situation. He's come out with what seems like an outrageous offer, and then he's given a 90-day pause to allow the haggling to occur.
Well, some people have said that the legacy take Trump literally, not seriously, whereas they should take him seriously, not literally. And what I mean by that in this context with the tariffs is that when he comes out and says we're putting in place reciprocal tariffs, that's not strictly true, because then when they say, well, how did you calculate these tariffs? They say, oh, well, we looked at the trade surplus or deficit with a particular country. Well, that has nothing to do with tariffs. That has to do with the relative balance of trade between those country pairings.
So take New Zealand, for example. We have a 2 to 8% tariff on some of the goods
Yes.
coming from America. And America has imposed a 10% tariff on us, which seems unfair. But
Yes.
that gives him some wiggle room.
Yes, because you can always, when you're negotiating in business, you can always come down, but you can't go back up. And so yes, you're right in that respect. You're bang on the money. It's a negotiating tactic in order to start high, so he has negotiating room to come down. Now, the legacy will then willfully misinterpret what he's doing, because he's come out with these hard stances. The vast majority of countries have come to the bargaining table and said, hey, look, we want to do a deal.
Vietnam is a great example
Vietnam's
of this.
a great example of this.
Interestingly enough, in the legacy media, what they reported it as is Vietnam has capitulated.
But Trump then says, right, we'll have a 90-day pause on the tariffs, and then the legacy media again use those words of war or words of fighting and say, oh, Trump's weak. He's not actually. What he's done is he started out in a hard position. Someone's given a little, so he gives a little. It's compromise, and that's where you build
negotiation.
Trust. It's called negotiation. It's also achieved a second thing, and that is it has isolated the belligerents. So even Vietnam has come to the table. Pretty much everyone else in the world has come to the table. China's been belligerent. And the EU, they've been a little bit more sneaky and subtle about it, but the EU have been belligerent as well. And so now he knows who the problem children are. He knows that they have been isolated, and everyone can actually see it. Whether the media report it or not, it can be seen.
If you're paying attention. And that's what I think the reason for us wanting to discuss this today is that you said to me earlier, we need to be skeptical of anyone who is selling fear. And I think that the legacy media is selling fear around the tariffs rather than giving the information and letting people make up their own minds.
Well, this is actually quite an important point, is that when the tariffs were put in place, or it really started getting serious, all of a sudden the share market started to correct significantly. The word crash has been used a lot in the media about it, But it's also been just volatility. It's gone down and then back up and down and up, and now it's down again.
Well, I think the crash itself is a very emotive word, because the first thing that comes to mind for most people when they hear stock market crash is 1929.
Yes.
And the mythology that surrounds that about
Yes.
how awful it was, the stock market crashed, which caused widespread poverty throughout the 1930s. Well, actually,
Yes.
no, that wasn't the case. What caused the poverty throughout the 1930s was, one, they had drought and dust storms
It was
that
a
caused
huge part of it.
it caused so much devastation in the food supply. And two, the policies were put in place by the American government at the time also exacerbated
They
this
exacerbated it. And this is actually what Milton Friedman won his Nobel Prize in economics for, was pointing out that the Great Depression was as much a monetary issue, that it was actually the decline in the supply of money that led to a liquidity crisis, which then was the actual problem. Now,
And that is government policy,
and that is to do with government policy.
not to do with a stock market crash. Because at the end of the day, the share market or the stock market crashing affects the very wealthy. If you have no money
Yeah.
in this share market, a crash in the shares is not going to affect you.
It doesn't, or not very much.
So with something like the tariffs, what it will do is it will actually benefit the poor, because the intention is to bring manufacturing back to the US,
Yes.
which is going to bring jobs back to the US, which is going to put money into people's pockets.
And I think this really puts a finger on not just what's happening with these tariffs, not just what led to the Trump revolution in the first place. I would say Brexit is another example of this, where, in the West, for decades, we have not looked after our working class and our poor.
And this is an interesting thing, because the leftists would say, well, we have looked after the poor, but it's not about handouts.
Yes.
It's not about giving social policies that make things free for people. It's about allowing people to get ahead. It's about opportunity. It's about removing the regulation, removing the amount of GST people are paying, allowing people to get ahead themselves through hard work, through what they can do.
One of the mainstream pundits that I've heard recently, he was saying that, who cares if you bring industry jobs back from China? They're the $25 an hour jobs. We don't want them. Correction, that privileged commentator doesn't want that job, but maybe some guy in flyover America does want that job, because maybe then he can afford to start a family, or maybe then he can work one job instead of two.
I think that's the thing, is that, and I think this brings it back to our cultural dreams, if you like, and the stories we tell ourselves. And I think this is indicative of how, if you were to ask young people today what they want to be, most of them are going to be like an influencer. Whereas it used to be that if you had a honest job, and you got honest pay, there was respectability and honor in that.
Yes.
And I think that if something doesn't have a glamorous job title, then according to our cultural gatekeepers, that we've given them this responsibility, we have said, you can tell us what our values are. And they are the ones who don't fancy working at the sawmill.
Exactly.
Or they don't fancy being the rubbish man. Or they don't fancy being a nurse.
Correct.
They only want the glamorous things, and therefore anything else is not desirable.
And so you get this disconnect between those that have a voice because they're wealthy and they're connected, and those that don't have a voice. So Brexit is another example of this. Those that wanted Brexit were those that were living in northern England and also the coastal cities. And I encountered it when I spent time living in Aberdeen for a while. Now, that's an oil and gas town, and the oil and gas people were doing just fine. But just up the road were a couple of towns called Peterhead and Fraserburgh.
Fishing villages?
Fishing villages. And they hated the EU because the EU had put in place rules which meant that everyone else could fish in British waters, but British ships couldn't fish anywhere. And so, well, they were allowed to fish. They were allowed to fish in their own waters, but they were being outcompeted in their own waters because effectively the EU had put trade barriers, even stricter than tariffs, that meant that the British fishermen could not actually fish in outside of their waters, whereas other people could.
It's literally taking food from their mouths.
It was literally taking food from their mouths. And then the establishment, based around London, they've never been to Peterhead. They've never been to Hull. They're perplexed as to why the British people voted Brexit.
Well, I think this comes back to the divide that we've got going on.
Yes.
The divide is that we tend to now live in echo chambers.
Yes.
So those people who have a voice in the media, or those people who are in the bureaucracy, they don't have anything to do with the people who are living the average life on the ground. And so they can't understand. When we don't talk to each other, we can't understand each other. We can't hear each other's point of view or have any empathy, putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes and going, right, I can understand where they're coming from.
Yes.
And the more we siloize our society, the more division we will have, because we are not talking to each other and we are not understanding each other's points of view.
Another point that I'd like to come back to, it's related to the Trump tariffs being reciprocal, because what that tells us right from the get-go, if Trump's tariffs were at least intended to be reciprocal or had an element of reciprocity, what that tells us is that the playing field wasn't level to start with. Mm-hmm. And here's another way that the playing field is not level to start with. A lot of these developing countries are not really just utilising low wage from poor people. They're actually utilising slave labour.
Yeah.
And this is something that we need to remember. Those industrial jobs that were gutted out of the West were gutted from free people working an honest day's work for an honest day's wage, and they were given those jobs to sweatshops, to slave labourers. So in actual fact, it was a transfer of wealth from the poor of the West to the wealthy of the developing nations. And this is, again, something that has not been well understood in the West, that we will play the politics of, oh, don't we need to support the developing countries? And it can even apply to when people are talking about reparations or giving aid to some of these countries. That money that is going to those developing countries is not going to the poor. It's going to the very wealthy. And so we need to be a lot wiser and smarter about how we run our policies, both international and domestic. And I'd like to suggest to people that, and it's an old cliche, but charity starts at home. Let's look after our communities first, and we can worry about the international scene later.
Well, that brings to mind, I heard somebody say that international aid means taking from the poor of a rich country and giving to the rich of a poor country.
It's exactly what it is.
And it assuages some guilt, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't help anybody.
How much did the UK give to India?
They give something like $100 million to India in international aid, and India has a space program that costs $100 million.
So Britain can't have a space industry, but India can.
And the tariffs is something that will benefit the working man. It is not something that will benefit the talking heads.
Yeah.
Just to bring it back to where we started with the tariffs and whether or not they are good or bad, I think the thing is that it's a lot more nuanced than the legacy media would like you to think. Also, there is the reciprocity that's in place. There's also the opportunities that it could provide to the working man of
There's the question
America.
mark as to whether or not we're actually dealing with a level playing field in the first place.
And I think don't buy into the fear.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us for this Considered Opinions podcast. We look forward to seeing you again next time, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.